to another episode of the Northern Roses podcast with me, Henry North, and Dr. Adam North.
Hi everyone, nice to be back.
How are you?
Yeah, good, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, but I've got to admit that this weekend in particular, I've kind of been thinking a lot about this idea of the rise of reform. And that really, in maybe 4 years' time, we could be living under a reform government, and the prospect of that is unsettling for me.
Yeah, I think it's worrying for lots of people after seeing the recent local election results and reform taking a few councils and Andrea Jenkins becoming mayor in, can you remember where it was? Lincolnshire.
Yeah, Lincolnshire, yeah.
So I think there is a fear that reform are on the rise, and I think there's also a fear that there's a real misunderstanding about what reform stand for, thinking that reform actually stand for reform, which I think if you look into their manifesto and what Nigel Farage stands for, it's not really reform.
No, and I watched a video from The Guardian, and it had one of their journalists, John Morris, maybe, I think his name was, I can't remember his second name, but he was walking around Lincolnshire, and there seems to be this big demand at the moment for reform, and they were doing things like claiming because there was some steelworks in Lincolnshire or Scunthorpe, and they'd stayed open 3-4 hours before it was going to shut down. They managed to get the government support, and this reform cabbie turns up and claims that it was all them, social media opportunity. And then you get the guy who was head of the union, and he says, no, they had nothing to do with it. And it's this idea that like reform are just anything that goes well or that people are happy with, they just jump onto the bandwagon.
Take credit for it.
Yeah, they take credit for it. And how can you stop the flow? How can you say, no, these guys are just opportunists? This is not what they're about.
No, they're not. They're not interested in actual policy decisions. So the mayor, Andrea Jenkins, who I think she was a Tory, she was the education minister who gave the middle finger to journalists, I'm pretty sure, and then she defected to reform. So when she became mayor, she vowed to sack the county council's diversity officers, classic kind of Trumpian, MAGA, get rid of any equality, diversity, inclusion. So she said, I'm going to get rid of them all, but there weren't any. There wasn't a single one in the council, and she was saying, we'll get rid of them. It's the same with low emission zones where you have to pay certain taxes to drive cars through. They've said, we're going to scrap all of them in reform controlled seats. There aren't any in reform controlled councils or areas. So they're making these promises they don't even understand the areas they control. And Nigel Farage, there's missing signs in Clapton for him because he's never there at his constituency, because none of them actually care about the national interest or governing. It is purely to do with power and control. Things that, voters feel disaffected with politics, and that's understandable with the Tories and austerity.
And Labour now.
Yeah, and now feeling that Labour haven't delivered on the change that was promised. But, and this is such a difficult thing to say, but even though Labour are not leading the changes that we would want to see, or many people across the country would want to see, reform are so much worse. They would do nothing. They would be tax cuts for the super rich and more austerity, even though today Farage promises to lift the 2-child benefit cap, which Labour have already been talking about. Labour will already do it, and then Farage will say, well, I forced Labour to do it. So it is political opportunism, where they project an image of themselves, reform, whilst secretly being completely opposed to reform. Whereas at least the Conservatives, at least people know that they're about trickle-down economics. They're about making the rich richer and hoping that eventually that leads to some kind of miracle growth for the poorest in society. They're kind of obvious about that. But reform make it seem like they are Labour, but they're wearing a mask, and behind the mask is just more conservatism.
Yeah, so I was just a bit worried about how you kind of stem the flow a little bit of this, because he's everywhere, isn't he?
Yeah, he's on all the media platforms all the time. He gets way more coverage than the Greens, who are comparably popular in
And
the country.
competent.
And competent. And the Lib Dems as well, who,
Yeah.
you know, the Lib Dems actually do quite well in terms of their political messaging. Like Ed Davies, quite a savvy communicator, knows how to grab attention. But Farage is able to grab more attention than most other politicians with really less power than, or as a comparable power as the smaller parties. But there was some good news today in a YouGov poll that showed that Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey are all seen as more competent leaders by voters in the polling. So I think there is this idea that there's popularity among the wider public for Farage, but I think that that is, again, because of the media attention he gets, doesn't translate into people really thinking he would be a good leader of the country.
And they do have a tendency to shout very loud, don't they, the Reform voters?
For me, the biggest absurdity of all is they won the Brexit referendum through their ability to grab attention, not get fact-checked, lie endlessly, and exactly what you said, just grab attention and shout the loudest. They won the Brexit vote, but everyone can see, everyone with two eyes and a brain, you could not have a brain and see that Brexit's been bad. Yeah. Brexit's been a disaster. There are simply no benefits of Brexit to date. Even Brexiteers couldn't tell you any benefits of Brexit. So everyone knows it's been a failure. This should be pinned on Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson and the Brexit team, they lied and they should have responsibility on their shoulders, but somehow, like a slippery, like Teflon Trump, Farage has that kind of snake-like ability that all of these con men do to escape being caught in
accountability.
They escape accountability and they commit fraudulent actions and they get away with it. They come back. But it's the classic con man trick of I conned you once, I'll con you again.
And he kind of knows how to say the right things. Well, have a pint of lager and a cigarette outside a pub and everyone thinks he's man of the people Farage. And it seems to be that easy, really.
Yeah, because if you don't... So political distrust in the UK has continued to grow. Like, we are at record levels of political distrust. And that is actually deserved. There has been so much wrong with how the country's been run for the past 15 years. We had... COVID was... Although we might think that the government did well over COVID, actually it was the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to the richest people. As maybe we'll put up a previous podcast where we discuss this. So I won't get into it here. Or you can see the article on the Northern Rose about why we need a wealth tax.
From the 24th of May.
Yeah. So the COVID was a disaster. Austerity's been a disaster. Political distrust has only grown as they've seen Tories give out lucrative contracts to their mates. You are right to not trust your politicians if you see that happening.
It's that blatant corruption.
It's corruption and it's in front of you. It's the same in the US. You see corruption, of course you're going to be distrustful. The problem though is to then go, they're all the same, and to simply lose all faith in politics only helps the worst of them. Because then Farage, people go, well, I might as well vote for Farage because they're all as bad as each other, but at least he seems like a good bloke, or he can have a laugh. Yeah, he's a chancer, he can have a laugh. But that's what leads to the real corrosion of democracy. With Trump, they just don't trust any politicians, so they go, well, at least, he's entertaining. He'll keep me entertained, or the cult of MAGA.
Says it how it is.
Yeah, and so the problem is that growing distrust is compounding. Because you get growing distrust, then more distrustful politicians get elected, leading to more distrust. So how do you break that cycle? That is the key question of our time, I think, is how do you break the cycle to increase trust in politics, to improve our public services and standard of living that will then compound positive trust over time? We can see that in action in certain countries. Certain Nordic, Scandinavian countries have high levels of political trust, which means that their countries are run more effectively, which leads to more trust over time. And this then creates a situation where they have low levels of inequality, very good public services, very high levels of happiness. We can see this. We can see, it's obvious, the evidence is so clear. Why are we not copying it? It's so obvious, and it's such an easy vision to present people. We will decrease inequality, which will lead to all of these benefits. That should be an easier message than Brexit. But the question we need to ask is, why is this vision not being presented?
And why are people, I guess, so willing to back Farage? That's just, for me, honestly, what I'm struggling with at the moment, is that I don't know if people see themselves in Farage and the likes of Richard Tice, but these guys are like, I wouldn't see them out and think, oh, they look cool, I want to be like them. Or maybe, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
Yeah, as is discussed in the article, you'll have to find the date, but the War on Wokeness article kind of discusses this. And I've found it talking to, your everyday... 12th of May. Everyday people, is that, first of all, they're not, again, as I said, I think it comes from a place of intelligence to be distrustful of politicians. It's completely reasonable to be like, well, I'm not going to trust my politicians, so at least I'll trust these guys, these kind of underdog characters. They build themselves as underdogs fighting against a political elite. But their creation of personal imaging and brand is fake. Nigel Farage is a political elite. He's worked in the financial sector before he went into politics. He was a banker. He banks with Coots. He got annoyed because Coots were getting rid of his bank account. These are not problems that actual people, 99% of people have to deal with. But they create this idea that they're on your side, which is appealing. It's like Trump. You want to feel that somebody is on your side, but they're not. They're not. They're only on their own side. But it's just an ability to manipulate in a environment that's ripe for manipulation. It's the idea of cryptocurrency, right? If you don't feel you can get rich, if you don't feel that those opportunities are there for you to own assets, you will believe that crypto is your solution, is your answer.
It's the future.
It's the future. And that's why you have all these crypto influencers saying, buy crypto, it'll make you rich. And people can be convinced by that because they feel like there's no other choice. And in many ways, they're right to think that because doors have been closed to them. And all of this stems from a lack of media attention to these issues. And we have to ask, who is funding reform? Who's leading to all this attention that they're getting? And it is media organisations controlled by billionaires who don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to pay wealth taxes. So in the weaponised wokeness article, that came from talking to people and them thinking that reform's a grassroots organisation. The workers have risen up in their anger and they're backing Nigel Farage, but it's not at all. They are funded by billionaires, like the GB News owner and various other people who will do absolutely anything, will create whatever chaos they have to in order to avoid paying extra taxes. Those taxes that will not affect their quality of life in any way, well, on their current proposals, which I talked about in the wealth tax article, won't affect their standard of life, but the greed is so incredibly... This is the thing that angers me the most. I think if more people knew about it, I think that anger is what we need to feel, because I think it can help us fight this time. It can mobilise it. Like, let's just give an example. Thames Water has been run in the most horrendous way to ever run a company. So first of all, the fact that water is privatised, I think we can all agree is ridiculous. How can you compete? It's all controlled by one company. You can't set up another water company and be like, now I'm going to compete and sell cheaper, better water. No, you need one company that runs it all. And it can't make profits because the money needs to be put back into it to make sure our water sources are protected and sewage isn't pumped into our rivers and streams. So they've been pumping shit into all the rivers and streams. They've allowed all the services to be degraded and fall apart while sucking out money as dividends to pay their shareholders. So the government has to bail them out with billions of pounds, and they tried to pay themselves bonuses with those government emergency, and I repeat that, emergency funds the government gave them so they didn't collapse. A water company, you can't do without your water. They tried to pay themselves bonuses, and the government had to say to them, you cannot use this money to pay yourselves bonuses. Now, for me, that is something that is so... It's like the bankers in 2008 being paid bonuses for causing the financial crisis. It's so outrageous that the fact that we don't see kind of mass protests is very surprising to me. Obviously, you could say that's hypocritical because we're not out there on the street, and I think that's fair enough. We are, but in London, where power is centralised, people should be out. They should be outraged. This is Thames Water. They should be up in arms. In previous times, there would be public guillotining, and I'm not advising for violence, but I'm saying there would have been violence because of these transgressions. And obviously, I think there is a problem with where power is centralised, and there'll be an article out this week about why I think power should be geographically moved, because that would be fairer for people across the UK. But I think if we want to increase public trust and prevent people like Nigel Farage and charlatans across the Reform candidate base, we have to build public trust again.
And when we're talking about what kind of money those water companies were getting, it's taxpayer money, isn't it?
Yeah, it's our money. It's our money.
And it's just... Another thing that has grinding my gears is I watched a video on YouTube about the Birmingham bin strikes, and you had on one side of the street the lefty pro-Palestine contingent, and on the other side you had the Britain First movement, and the journalist was jumping from side to side to get interviews from each one, and then he goes over to speak to some people from Britain First, and they come over and they say, well, look, I consider myself quite moderate, I'm all for the best for Britain, but what I cannot stand for is people coming over here illegally on small boats and getting everything on a silver platter. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, name me one person who's come over here, illegally or not, as a migrant, and has been treated better than someone who's grown up here. I mean, don't get me wrong, like, there's probably people who have grown up here and are not getting treated very well. But that's a failure of the system. But to think that someone's come here in a minority ethnic group or fleeing some kind of conflict, come here and had everything handed to them, I was just like, what? Where are these people then?
Yeah, well, I think a good point for that is if your country won't even treat your own most vulnerable, poorest people well, you think they're going to treat other countries poor and vulnerable well? No, they're not. And that's the problem, is that we pride ourselves on a country with certain values, but we do not uphold these values. But we project it across the world. Say to the world, we are kind, generous, open, warm-hearted peoples. But we don't actually mean that. Because if you come here and we say illegal
us a
or
nation
legal...
of gaslighters.
Well, if we are to be a nation that practices what we preach, we really need to change how we treat people.
Well, I've been actually trying to work on a story at the moment about the state of the NHS mental health care in Greater Manchester, and it is in crisis mode, and it is shambles. And there are our most vulnerable people. The stats were something like, of all the people that are referred to the mental health service, 12.5% of people get seen and 8% get processed. And even then, what does being processed count as? And it's just, honestly, it had been getting me down. And then for people to then think that Reform have got the answer, it's just like there's this big disconnect at the moment. And I worry that by the time the next election comes around, people aren't going to see through it. They're going to fall for it in a massive, massive way.
It's like we said in the last podcast, racism works to obfuscate and disconnect people from the actual problems. Racism acts as a tool to say, here is the problem, it's the other, rather than saying the problem can be solved here at home. And like you said about the mental health crisis, and all of our public services, they are falling apart, but they could easily be funded with a small change that would not put much of a burden on anyone. Like a wealth tax on wealth over £10 million. So say you own £10 million worth of assets, you're only wealth taxed on your 11th million and beyond. That would, as has been estimated, raise £24 billion. Just that alone. That's 2%. On wealth over 10 million, 24 billion. I think that's personally not enough. I think if people own over £100 million, they should be paying way more than 2%. And that would help us to fix all of these problems. And then not only that, you could say, well, working people, we could decrease your income tax because you work for a living. You shouldn't, the burden of responsibility shouldn't come on you. You're just trying to build a better life. But those who already have all this wealth, they should contribute more. And that actually allows more mobility in the country. This idea we have of upwards mobility. If you want to move up into the middle class, you need to earn enough money through your income to buy assets. But if the wealthy have so much money that they can gobble up and possess all the assets, how can the middle class even dream? Or how can the working class even dream of moving into the middle class? And so the middle class begins to shrink because they have to sell assets because the rich can buy them all up. And as they have done and as they will continue to do, the middle class continues to shrink and mobility becomes impossible. And this is the vision of these very wealthy people, is a system where there is no movement. It's feudalism. The top stay at the top. Their children stay at the top. Their children's children stay at the top. There is no ability for anyone else to ever own anything close to what they have.
Just deeply entrenched power.
Entrenched hierarchy. That's what they talk about. That's what they believe in. They do not believe in bringing people up with them. They only believe in kicking people down. Yeah. They are bullies and they are against the values that we supposedly have.
For me, I think I kind of look back to when I was a child and what I was taught about. And it's kind of like these values that post-Second World War, that people went out to fight against fascism. And after the Second World War, it was a great celebration of everything that wasn't fascism. It was like then the NHS welfare state. And you could look your fellow country person in the eye and know that they had a certain level of dignity to them. Because the British way of life, that was like pride in each other and themselves. And now it's this idea that we're kind of going to a way that I personally think is quite fascist, about hierarchies, deeply entrenched hierarchies.
Yeah.
That people have no power and they're just told what to do. And a lot of it is based on where you're born or who you're born to. And it's just, I worry that people aren't going to realise this, and we are sleepwalking into something that is going to be catastrophic.
Well, I think this links to the David Graeber article that I put out, and the ideas of David Graeber, who argued that these messages that we give to children, or that we're taught growing up, things like two wrongs don't make a right, or we need to share nicely, we need to be generous, or we need to treat everybody with respect and dignity. These values are not the values that the world actually has. Right? These are values that we teach kids to have, but then we grow up and we become disaffected because we see the world isn't fair. People aren't treated this way. The people at the top do not want to share their resources that they have vast amounts of. So we're basically teaching kids a lie of a world that doesn't exist, but that we wish would exist. And David Graeber argued that we need to be able to envision once again that we can change the world to make it that way. The world that we tell kids, the world that we wish existed, could exist. And actually, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be unfair. It doesn't have to be the case that two wrongs in many cases do make a right in the world in which the society in which we've built. And so I think it's about reassessing what world we want to exist. And if we want a better one to exist, we need to strive for equality and fairness and all of these values which I think people think that we have, but we don't practice them.
I've just got a feeling that we're going backwards at the minute.
Well, you can't go back. You can only go forwards. It's just what version of forwards is it? Is it a version of forwards that's nostalgic for the past, like MAGA? Or is it a version of the future that says we've made mistakes in the past? How can we be better? How can we move forwards, not go back? Because you can't go back. But how do we make the world a place where we would want our kids to grow up in and not feel when they get to 18, 19 that actually the world wasn't what they were told it was, that things aren't fair, that opportunities aren't available.
And you have to look to a guy like Andrew Tate to help you through the world. It's just...
Yeah, because that's the thing. A lot of kids see these people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson and they think they're telling me a more accurate version of the world.
A cynical one.
Hierarchy, of power. And in many cases that is the world that exists. But that isn't the world that we want it to be. We want the world to be a place where your place and your position, you shouldn't abuse the power. You should use it to bring the others up. Whereas their philosophy is you kick others down and you assert your dominance over them. Whereas I think most of us, I mean, some people will actually just agree with that ideology.
Definitely.
But I think most of us still want and believe in an ideology of bring the others up with us.
And
the
just
idea
have
of
pride in your community and the people around you, I think.
Yeah, but so there's this concept of zero-sum games. A zero-sum game, in short, is one person wins, another person has to lose. And this is how people like Trump see the world. For America to win, Vietnam has to lose. For America to win, China has to lose. That philosophy is destructive because there is no end goal to the game that we're all within. There's no end goal. We actually live in a world where it should be something called non-zero sum, where what we need to realize is, for me to win, you have to also win. We all have to win. And so the sum isn't zero. For me to win, you don't have to lose. We all have to work together. And that is the kind of fall of the Berlin Wall, the globalist vision was a world in which everyone worked together. The United Nations,
European Union.
What Francis Fukuyama called the end of history was this notion that now we all work together. But what's come back in, and I think what's fed into it, is this hierarchy and this notion of acquiring as much as possible, is that it's no longer about growing and getting stronger together. It's about I win, you lose. And that was how trickle-down economics worked for so long. They said the rich will get rich, but their accumulation of assets will lead to you accumulating assets. It doesn't work like that, though, and it's been proven not to work like that. So now we need to reassess how we think about things and what we do to change that situation. I will argue in an article that just starting on now, thinking about how the royal family are a symbolic example of entrenched hierarchy. So we send a message out to the world that we accept that. We accept some people are born better. They don't have to pay inheritance tax. They are born with advantages over other people. We accept that in our national story.
But that's entrenched by the law, isn't it, as well? It's not, some people think this idea of the royal family aren't powerful, but they are. We have in our legal system that it's not fair, that some people are better than others. And it boggles my mind at the moment that some people aren't either willing, or I don't know what it is, but there's certain people in this country that should be taking a great deal more of accountability than they are, and it's just being directed to completely the wrong people. And I'm glad that we're doing this and we're trying to raise awareness, but I am at a bit of a loss.
I think that is how people feel, but I am hopeful because I am sympathetic to people who feel disaffected, who feel support for Farage. I can understand how you could get there. And that's the key point. When you understand how people can get there, you can recognise what needs to be done to change it, what needs to be done to fix it. Wealth tax is popular across the country. We need to push for it. We need to fight for it. Because ultimately, most of us actually feel the same way about things. We understand the same things. A lot of us all feel disaffected about this, but it's about understanding and it's about trying to have these conversations with each other. I'm in a privileged position that my work allowed me to gather information and see evidence and read books that brought me to this conclusion. Other people don't have that time or energy, and I understand that. But that's why it's about having sympathy and saying, I recognise that you don't have the time and you feel let down, and that's completely understandable, but here is a solution to your problems. And as I talked about in the wealth tax article, I don't think there are simple solutions. These are complex problems, but a wealth tax is actually quite a simple beginning to solving a very complicated problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for it, and from my point of view, I can see how people feel that disillusion can lead you down that road, but I'm just at a point now where I just don't know if we can get through to them. But I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep trying, keep pushing for things like a wealth tax, and about staying positive, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's about saying as well to anyone who's listening that If you can convince one person that reform are not acting in their interests, you've pushed the needle. And if we think, and I often felt this way as well when I was younger, that your vote means nothing. But it does. No, people, our ancestors fought tooth and nail. They died. They lost their lives for these small pieces of power that we have. And we have to use them, because if we use them, we can grow them. We can increase the amount of power we have. But if we just give up, we give up the small bits that we even had in the first place. So it's about building that platform. And we have to be hopeful for it. We tend to think that we are at the end of some political process. You know, we're at the end of history. We're not. We're still at the beginning. Yeah. We've only just started. And we have to see it that way. Like, if you just think you can put your head down, do your work, enjoy yourself, not worry about politics, you're letting the side down, because we're only at the start. You know, if we really want a better future, you know, if you want to have kids, or you have kids and you want to make the world better for them, you have to be political. Otherwise, they will not be middle class for long.
Or even if they are now. Well, we are now at 30, well, more than half an hour long podcast, and we were going to actually have a bit of theoretical chat here and probably some deep analysis, but we've just gone on a rant, really. It started by me, but I think maybe I might be echoing what a lot of people are feeling at the moment. But yeah, like Adam said, it's not all doom and gloom, and when you try and at least have the conversation with one person that what Reform are saying is not in their best interests, and to get... but I guess then people might ask for an alternative, and I don't know where to go from there. But we're going to keep trying here.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you for listening. And if you do want to support the podcast and the Northern Rose in general, we do really appreciate you joining our subscriber list. So you can put your email in, and that can really influence the kind of people we can now interview.
The algorithms.
Yeah, the algorithms, but also potential guests for our podcast. And also maybe if you could recommend this to your friends would be a great help.
And I met Zach Polanski last week, so running for the leadership. He's running a leadership bid for the Green Party, so maybe we can talk about that next week, is what do the Green Party offer, as we've talked about reform today.
So there we go. We can offer a alternative opinion to reform. How about that for people that are stuck up with Labour? Understandably so. Okay, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Bye.